Today's session is on differentiation, particularly looking at how to differentiate for gifted students within the regular ed classroom. So what is differentiation? Curriculum differentiation is a process used to maximize student learning by improving the match between a student's individual needs and the curriculum. It's also a general term used to describe the range of strategies which are used to ensure children's needs are met. Adapting the curriculum to meet the unique needs of learners by making modifications in complexity, depth, and pacing is also a way of looking at differentiation. Teachers can differentiate the content, the process, and the product, and we're going to be looking at these three pieces today. For the content, you look at the knowledge, skills, and attitudes we want children to learn. Differentiating content requires that students are pre-tested, whether formally or informally, so the teacher can identify the students who do not require direct instruction. You can also differentiate the process, where you vary learning activities and strategies to provide appropriate methods for students to explore the concepts. It's important to give students alternative paths to manipulate the ideas. You can look at different grouping methods, graphic organizers, maps, diagrams, charts, etc. You can also differentiate the product, where you vary the complexity of the product that students create to demonstrate mastery. Students may create a video, or write an essay, or do a skit. All of these are ways of differentiating the product. You can also differentiate according to students' readiness, interest, and learning style. Some students are ready for different concept skills or strategies. Others may lack the foundation needed to progress to further levels. This is where the pretest comes in very handy. You can also differentiate according to students' interest. Student interest inventories provide information to plan different activities that respond to students' interests. Some students like movies, some students like getting up and moving around. Some students would much rather have the teacher explain it to them. All of this is important information for you. You can also differentiate according to the student's learning style. Individual student preference for where, when, and how they can obtain and process information. Some students are visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. This is where a multiple intelligence scale will be helpful. You can also differentiate the environment, the social organization, or the physical circumstance of the classroom. Differentiation strategies are grouped into three parts. Part 1 looks at the pre-assessment, curriculum compacting, and learning contracts. Pre-assessment can be very formal, where you give a pretest, or where you talk to the student. It's a less formal way of doing that. Curriculum compacting then follows the pre-assessment. If the students have mastered some standards, you can then move beyond those so that you can focus on the things they don't know and enrich their opportunities. Learning contracts we covered in an earlier professional learning session. Part 2 looks at differentiating by interest, learning style, and challenge levels. We're really going to focus here today looking at the content, the process, and the product. Flexible grouping also goes into Part 2, but that's something you're familiar with based on your center model. Part 3 looks at tiered assignments. We're going to look at that at the end of the session. It also looks at choice boards or tic-tac-toe menus, which we've provided at previous sessions as well. Anchoring activities and varying questions are two that we will tackle at another date. So first you start with prior knowledge or readiness. So look at a pre-assessment. You can do a very formal pre-assessment with a textbook pretest. You could have student-teacher conferences and talk about what they know and what they're still struggling with. You can have them write a journal, write what you know about X topic. You can also have a very informal teacher observation where you notice what's going on in the classroom and what they're struggling with. The pre-assessment doesn't have to be formal, but it does need to provide you with information about your students. As the quote says, you can't figure out what to teach them if you don't know them. Take a moment and jot down some ideas for a pre-learning assessment for your upcoming unit. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video. I love this little cartoon because it captures the idea of pre-assessment perfectly. The student says, "I've mapped out the concepts I've already grasped to save you time." Unfortunately, it's not always that easy, so it falls on us to figure out what they know and what they need to know. So here we're going to look at the content, the process, and the product, and these three things go hand in hand. I want to caution you, you do not need to differentiate the content, the process, and the product for every single unit. You will wear yourself out. The content looks at the knowledge, the concept, or the skill, and often how the information is presented, whether it's varying levels of reading material, lecture, etc. Process looks at what the students do with the material as they learn it, the thinking, problem solving, research. Are they asked to manipulate it in some way? The product looks at how they're going to present the knowledge they've learned. This could be done through a visual, it could be orally, it could be kinesthetic, it could be a written response. All of those are products. So this chart takes us a little bit deeper into the content, the process, and the product and how they interact for the learning experience. Content in general should be centered around broad-based themes, issues, or problems. This will make your life simpler as you're trying to determine what different pieces the students are going to be reading. So say you take a topic such as poverty. That gives you a broad enough topic to differentiate. It should also be in-depth and with some breadth. At all times, if it can be, self-selected based upon student interests and strengths. It should also be advanced in both complexity and sophistication. These two things do not always go hand in hand. You don't want to give a student a very difficult piece to read that's also about a very difficult topic. So you have to kind of balance those two. Processes should be independent and self-directed, yet balanced with group dynamics. Students need a variety of interactions. It definitely should be stimulating of higher levels of thinking. What they're asked to do needs to kind of be higher order. If at all possible, creative, with a chance to solve problems and solve them. It also should be open-ended, using discovery or problem-based learning where appropriate. Products should be geared towards considering real problems, challenging existing ideas, and creating new ones. If at all possible, it should be self-selected. This is where giving students a choice on how they're going to prove their knowledge is very helpful. Also, it should be made to help students shift from being consumers of information to producing knowledge. This is why you'll find a lot of these projects have to do with presentations or creating something to share with other people. So we're going to do a couple of examples. We're going to start with content, and I picked a social studies standard. It says, the student will explain the importance of the basic principles that provide the foundation of a Republican form of government. So what is that going to look like if we're differentiating the content? Because they all have to learn and master this standard. You can provide different levels of articles, books, textbooks, etc. You can also differ the type of content, some students watching a video, some students listening to a lecture and taking notes, independent reading, small group reading, etc. All of that will vary the content. If you will, turn and talk to your neighbor about what differentiated content would look like for an upcoming unit for you. If you need additional time, please feel free to pause the video. The process, we're going to look at a math standard. Interpret whole number quotients of whole numbers. Interpret 56 divided by 8 as the number of objects in each share when 56 objects are partitioned equally into 8 shares, or as a number of shares when 56 objects are partitioned into equal shares of 8 objects each. So how does this look like? What processes are we going to differentiate? Well, you can do this through interest centers. Some students can be working with manipulatives. Some students can be listening to a lecture discussion where they're getting more remediation. You could have small groups. Some students are working with graphical organizers. Some students are working on a computer game, all of which reinforce this same skill and help them practice it in different ways. For the product, I picked a science standard. Students will model the position and motion of the Earth in the solar system and will explain the role of relative position and motion in determining sequence of the phases of the moon. In this case, the students need to be able to show you what they've learned. So we're going to look at a variety of products here. Some students can create a paper model using cutout shapes. Some students can do more hands-on and create a 3D model. You could have students create a Prezi. You could have students write a paragraph explaining this to to someone who doesn't understand this, like a third grader. All of these are different ways of producing a product. If you will, jot down ideas for how to differentiate the product for your upcoming unit. This chart takes an interesting look at how we can differentiate learning experiences. It takes this topic of fractions and it breaks it down for you with a process, a concept, and a product. And the process over here is the justifying, design, comparing that tie in with your evaluation, synthesis, analysis, etc. So for evaluation, it says justify learning about fractions in a debate or persuasive essay. Synthesis, design a game that teaches about fractions. Analysis says compare fractions and decimals on a Venn diagram. All of these vary what the students are being asked to do, your process, with the product over here. And so there are various levels of difficulty here. So this is one way of looking at how to differentiate. Tiered assessments or tiered assignments are very similar. Tiered learning experiences provide appropriately challenging learning activities for students on all thinking levels. In this case, we're going to look at tiered assessments, which provide students with an advanced level task appropriate to their learning level. An example of tiered assignment. Tier 1 says, describe the leadership style of Wilson or Roosevelt. Tier 2 takes it a little bit deeper. In what ways were these two leaders, Wilson and Roosevelt, alike and different in their leadership? They're starting to evaluate. It's a little bit higher order thinking. Tier 3, In what ways were these three leaders alike and different in their leadership? Who was the best leader and why? And this one is maybe not the best example in that it adds an additional person, so it's adding more content, but it's definitely asking them to go ahead and make an argument and support it. So it's definitely a little bit more difficult than the Tier 2 question. This is also a way of looking at the tiered lesson planning guide, and this one's also from Weinbrenner. For our first one, we're looking at the strand of writing, and students are to prepare writing in a format appropriate to audience and purpose. She separates her students up into entry level, advanced, and then most challenging. And of course, these would be fluid groupings. So an entry level activity is to read a newspaper account of the sinking of the Titanic and record 6 factual errors reported. Correct all errors, cite sources. An advanced activity would be to create a list of 10 changes that were put in place after the sinking of the Titanic to avoid similar disasters. They then have to explain the direct connection to mistakes made in the creation and operation of the Titanic. The most challenging activity is to write a historical document detailing important events in the lives of 3 survivors from the Titanic, include personal and professional information, hypothesize how their survival impacted them regarding their contributions to the world. My references for today were georgiastandards.org, Tomlinson's How to Differentiate Instruction in Mixed Ability Groups, and Weinbrenner, Teaching Gifted Kids in Today's Classroom. If you would like additional help with differentiating for your gifted students, please feel free to contact me or your gifted support specialist. Thank you and have a nice day.